Exam 2 will be similar to Exam 1. There will be 20 multiple choice questions, and then there will be 5 words from the vocabulary list that you're going to need to provide the definitions for. Again, these are not words that require long definitions, and I would say that they're probably words that you're going to recognize jump off the page as pretty central to the idea of producing oil and gas. And then there'll be several short answer questions where I'll ask you to explain certain important concepts. We've studied a couple of major elements. One is, how do you drill a well? Then how do you complete a well? Then what does it look like to produce a well over the long haul? And then what are the financial implications of those expenses? And finally, how do you go about financing that? And so I'll be a little picture up in the top corner of the slides as we run through this to remind you of the central elements. This is the note-taking guide from the DVD that we watched. As an aside, you can, if you want to rewatch the DVD or certain sections of it, you can go into D2L and where it talks the communication tab, and the bottom tab is the virtual classroom, and it actually has recordings of all the classes that we've done. And the classes where we watched the DVDs, it's not a very good copy, but you can go back and watch specific sections if you feel like you need to. However, it's probably more time efficient if you have a specific question, just use your textbook to look it up. So here's what I especially want you to know. I want you to know the major rig components, and you should be familiar with these. Now, there's only 1 or 2 questions that are going to come out of this, but I would like you to be familiar with these. I want you to know the personnel, their names, who they're working for, and what they do. And the reason I'm so big on the rig components and the workers around the rig is you just don't want to embarrass yourself, simply put, by calling somebody by the wrong title or talking about someone in the wrong context. Excuse me. Then there are the major things that we do with the rig. Some things that you're going to want to especially be aware of is what's involved with setting casing and cementing, because those 2 things go hand in hand. Also, we talk about the benefits of mud and what goes with mud, and so that's important. Another issue that comes up is the idea of lost circulation. Make sure you're familiar with that and ready to deal with that. And then directional drilling. These are 3 terms that were used in the DVD, but I can tell you this idea of directional drilling is an area where you've got one of those extended answer questions. So you really need to understand the concept of directional drilling. You can Google it. You can read the section in the textbook on that, or you can go back and rewatch the DVD, but make sure that you are very up on the idea of directional drilling, and that's these words in here. Nothing on the well evaluation. And then another major concept that I want you to understand very well is the idea of fracking. Only a couple of words on our DVD, but there were some good discussion of what it means to frack a well. I'm going to stop the video and change media that we're looking at and proceed. Up next is the idea of completing the well that you've drilled. We talked about the casing heads and Christmas trees. I recommend that you go back and rewatch this video, not because there's a specific test question that comes from it, but this will give you a good recap of what it means to drill a well and remind you of the process. And then we talked about fracking. Fracking is one of those things I expect you to understand very, very well. And so there's a great YouTube video to go back and review it. You can also go back and reread the textbook, but be advised that there's probably 3 or 4 questions involving fracking, so you're going to need to know that very well. Not a specific question, but understand in the vertical wells, the non-shale wells, the type of reservoir drives, whether it's the gas, water, and how the gas cap, because that ties into the various ways that you produce a well. No specific questions on the pump jacks, but it's important to understand the difference between a pump jack and an electronic submersible pump and which does better when. So you might want to watch this video as well. And then the idea of improved versus enhanced recovery. What are we talking about? How does it work? And what are the economic uh, situations that you deal with? Very important that you be able to answer this question. What are the questions before you go ahead with any of these sorts of issues? And then into the production, make sure you know about separators. And again, the idea of watching that video will help you make sure that you understand. Nothing on either of these topics. Nothing on the surface handling of gas. What goes wrong over time is an issue that you need to be familiar with. And we talked about in class, not only these are the elements of lease operating expenses, but we looked at some of the drawing, or we looked at some of the data on what drives, or I don't want to say what drives, but what are some of the major expenses in lease operating expenses. So I would be prepared to answer that question of why do wells vary with their lease operating expenses, and what are some of the major expenses that you typically see in operating a lease. Okay, let me change slides again. And then we get into the basics of finance. And so make sure that you understand the difference between debt and equity. In the summary slide in this presentation, it talks about a lot of companies finance through a combination of both. So you need to know the pros and the cons of both debt versus equity financing, both public and private. And so you see down there this idea of costs and obligations. There's no specific questions about Diamondback Energy. I just use this to illustrate it and try to increase your learning. Then we talked about moving from publicly traded companies like Diamondback, who do use public equity and some idea of debt through bonds and the like. The idea of private companies. The thing I want to make sure you're well up on is the reserve-based lending. Why do people use it? How does it work? What are the pros and cons? Also, I want you to be familiar with private equity, how it works, what are the pros and the cons, what's involved there. And then the summary. I want you to be very comfortable with the discussion of what does it take to raise money, that it's typically a combination of debt and equity. What are the trade-offs between the two? Because there are probably a couple of short answer questions involving these sorts of issues and a multiple choice or two talking about these. So even though I go over them pretty quickly here, you're going to want to be up on the various financing things. Some other issues that we looked at in the course are AFEs, and financially, I want you to understand what are the major expenses that typically drive the drilling and completion of a horizontal well. And keep in mind that a vertical well, it's largely the same cost. Fracking tends to be less expensive because you're only fracking one or two zones in a well. So as opposed to a horizontal well where you may be doing, as we saw, one of the frac jobs was like 65 stages. So to summarize again, on the well, the idea of drilling the well, know the people's names, know some of the big pieces of the rig, know some of the major functions like setting casing and cementing, like lost circulation. Especially make sure you understand directional drilling, sliding, and what's involved with that, because that's a big part of understanding how people do the shale plays. Likewise, make sure you understand fracking. Several questions on fracking. And then operating a well, what tends to be the long-term issues with operating a well, what's enhanced recovery, what's improved recovery, what are the issues involved with them, and then get into the financial aspects, debt versus equity. How is it used in the oil and gas industry? And if you can do all those things well, you're going to do very well on the test. And I can guarantee you in the 9 minutes and 45 seconds that I've talked on this video so far, I've given you every test question you need to worry about. Good luck.